So my name is Jordan. Thank you for the opportunity here today. So this presentation is on the decentralized funding for science's final frontiers, and that is frontiers plural. That's not a typo, and I kind of kept that ambiguously vague to make sure everyone came back from the break and didn't leave early for lunch. But since whoever's here is here, I'll disclose that for the sake of this, the final frontiers are human longevity and space travel. And these, at first glance, these may seem totally unrelated, but these are two largely underallocated areas of science by legacy financiers, and they may be more interconnected than you think. This niche area is futuristic, Web3 friendly, and has a big following and ripe for the dedicated collaboration of a DAO of its own. And this here is a boiled down kind of map of what we're going to talk about today. I'm kind of committing the cardinal sin of telling two stories at once, but please bear with me. So there's a science problem in space health and human longevity. They're both underfunded and emerging fields that will have increasing importance and impact on human life as with time. And then there's the science solution for that, which is the Consortium for Space Health and Human Longevity. There's a big funding problem in that both of these are new fields with historically low allocation that's not increasing anytime soon. And then we're hoping to create a funding solution for this using the SpaceDAO. So I'll kind of give a brief introduction on both of these science problems, talk about the science solution, a brief discussion about the funding problems, and then the funding solution. So we'll start here with the space health. So space is a hazardous environment. It's challenged by many novel exposures as well as the lack of luxuries here on Earth. These hazards have many health consequences, as you can see here, which have clinical manifestations through this collage of insults that result in many forms of disease. So here we see some of the diseases resulting from spaceflight, including muscle atrophy, heart atrophy, leaky gut, bodily fluid shifts, neural and cognitive impairments, immune dysfunction, inflammation, kidney stones, and bone demineralization. Now, many, but not all of these are also considered age-relating diseases, except they happen at a far more accelerated rate in space than here on Earth. This presents a huge challenge for deep space exploration, multiplanetary species, but where we need to live longer, not shorter, to make those human accomplishments. But it also presents a huge opportunity to study aging at an accelerated pace, since aging studies on Earth are largely limited by the long follow-up study duration needed to achieve clinical endpoints, as well as to achieve statistical significance. So for the more numerically inclined people, as I would suspect many of you are, this is a table that has more detailed rates of aging on Earth and in, I guess, space aging and Earth aging. Now, this is an oversimplification here is that you could say, on average, these systems age at roughly a 30-fold increase in space or in low Earth orbit compared to on Earth. Again, this is an oversimplification. Some of these pathways and systems are more influential in the aging process than others. And there are many countermeasures and compensations, both physiologically and behaviorally, that can dampen this effect. But I digress. We're here to talk about DeSci and the opportunity here. So there are some these are both kind of exploding industries, the space economy, as you can see with the rise of commercial spaceflight tourism, space hotels, etc., as well as what many consider the silver tsunami or the aging demographic of the world, especially in developed countries. Now, despite these trends, NASA only allocates about 1/3% to biology and physiology research, and I understand why. Like, if you can't get to space, it doesn't really matter how your body's going to react to it. Many of this budget is almost entirely engineering, and I agree it's for a good reason. But the problem is that astronauts have significantly lower lifespans than their Earth counterparts, and there are many risks and questions that remain unsolved. On the other hand, the NIH only allocates about 0.5% of total budget to fundamental aging research, despite about 80% of all deaths in the US attributed to aging-related pathology and disease. Furthermore, if you submit a grant for space health to NASA, they'll say, oh, this is a health problem, submit it to the NIH. If you submit it to the NIH, they say, oh, this is a space problem, submit it to the NASA. I mean, we've been playing this cat and mouse game for quite a while now. So I think that this creates the fundamental opportunity for a DAO to both kind of address this unmet area in science, as well as expand it to new and upcoming scientists exploring new areas. So this is how this is how kind of legacy financing goes in science. You have, well-established scientists in well-established areas promote or kind of advancing their hypothesis, their dogma around a certain disease, pathway, molecule, etc. They have preliminary funding from previous grant that they use to apply for grants. They outcompete other grants because they have preliminary funding. Then they incrementally advance that field. Say you're a new scientist or the science transitioning from one area to a new area, or trying to start a new area of science. You don't have that discretionary funding. You don't have that preliminary data. Ultimately, your grant gets rejected over and over again. And the field never develops. The field never advances. There are no real moonshots in science. They are just basically confirming what has already been found or advancing what the grant committee really is invested in. So this is why we have largely developed the Consortium for Space Health and Human Longevity. What is it? So it's kind of a mouthful. So for the sake of this, just to, speed it up, it's CSHL provides funding for labs affiliated with the consortium centers, as well as individuals interested in contributing to advance the understanding of the intersection between space and aging biology, with an emphasis towards translational research. So again, here it's at the intersection between spaceflight pathology and geriatric pathology. And we hope to roll this out in 3 phases. First with mostly the US, and then expand this to North America and Europe, as well as then go globally. We kind of have to tread lightly doing this because there are several types of restrictions around who can have access to NASA's data and how those funds can be distributed, etc. So we do have to kind of roll this out in phases and be very cognizant of those restrictions. Right now, we have about 6 institutions involved with the consortium right now. As shown here, we hope to expand this more towards individual contributors to address some of the problems that we're facing that I'll talk about in a second. So this is housed actually at the Buck Institute for Aging, just north of San Francisco. So we actually have some dedicated lab space for this that we hope to expand upon recently. So what is it? We have frequent grant cycles, a network of diverse expertise, annual conference and retreat, investor networks to hopefully spin out some of the innovations into startup companies, clinical and advisory boards to fine-tune experiments to have the most translational impact, and collaborative databases and biobanks to verify some of the findings for ground analog experiments or spaceflight experiments, etc. So the IP from spaceflight engineering has really not only spun out into several companies, but entire industries in general. And this is largely from the large engineering budget that we talked about earlier. Everything from solar panels to Velcro to MRIs to smoke detectors have all come from NASA technology. Some of the largest unexpected ROIs from government funding have been from NASA. And I think there's an equal, if not larger, opportunity for space health and biomedical research to advance healthcare on Earth, particularly in the longevity field due to the phenomena that we talked about earlier. So the type of IP and the type of projects that the consortium in the DAO are mostly going to prioritize are both research tools and patient and crew care. So just to talk about research tools for a second, a lot of these were developed in the 80s ish to basically evaluate the impact of microgravity on genes, etc., and kind of archaic type biospecimens. There's huge opportunity here to modernize some of these approaches for human organoids on, or organoids on a chip, and all kinds of assembloids, etc., to kind of bring this into the modern era. So on the right here, we have a rotary cell culture, which basically spins biospecimens to create a net zero or microgravity force. That one with the squiggly line, that's a random positioning machine, which basically spins best specimens in a random to create another type of vector force. These need to be kind of modernized, and we spent a lot of time on doing this. And I think that this would be a great way for people interested in space medicine to contribute from an individual perspective with 3D printers or CAD design, etc. There's also this opportunity for miniaturizing lab equipment for in-flight experiments, as well as kind of designing experiments for recording and monitoring cells in microgravity experiments. On the right, we have, these are just kind of projected areas of innovation. I don't think anyone foresaw the development of Peloton or anything from previous spaceflight experiments, but these are kind of what we would project, the advancement of telehealth, advancements in osteoporosis, risk assessment scores, exercise equipment, and even drug discovery and wearables. So we actually had a first spin-out company from this consortium in the collaboration called Cosmica Biosciences, just to give like a brief example of this, which studies mostly immune aging in space. It uses drug signatures from analog experiments and then verifies these with in-flight astronaut data to develop gene signatures and identify drugs that can reverse those signatures and then advance those for investigating longevity on Earth through clinical trials, on Earth. So the leaders of this consortium would be David Furman, Cheryl Nickerson, Ashton, Dr. Weiner, Mason, Eric Antonsen. These are the formation of the consortium to kind of increase awareness of this area and kind of bring funding to some of their own labs, as well as others that can advance the field. And then the advisors for this would be Yothia, Allison, and myself. And then we're going to hopefully do this through the SpaceDAO. So here, go back one second. So this is the centers right now. We hope to expand this in multiple phases, as mentioned earlier. I got an error, 1 second. So then we would obviously deploy these tokens to a cryptocurrency exchange for funds, which would fund the consortium. Project proposals from centers or individuals would be vetted by SpaceDAO stewards. Those would be voted on in the marketplace using tokens for which ones are funded, which ones are not. Those would be deployed to a smart contract, and the grants would go to the centers or individual contributor or proposal submitters. The advances from these would both benefit the SpaceDAO users through anti-aging technologies, commercial products or supplements. Then the intellectual property would go to the consortium, which would have some bargaining power over the licensing deals for these. And then those would go back to support the consortium and the token holders. And so the SpaceDAO community, I think having a DAO is very much very similar to starting a community. You need to make sure everyone's engaged and it's worth their while. And so we hope to have annual meetings, healthy aging coaching, extended podcast series, extended webinars to keep their interest. And obviously, also, we've been looking into kind of doing more decentralized science with the contributors, whether we find through the saliva test we do with astronauts that a certain molecule is increased in space. Does that actually correlate with aging? We can send out test tubes to the group and pull this together and keep everyone engaged and supporting the DAO in general. So this is kind of the stages we're at. We have the formation, and we're doing a capital raise and the tokenization of the DAO. We hope to have an official launch in January and then start the first cycle with the first phase, and then increase the recruitment with each grant cycle and roll this out in an organized manner. So like I said, January 2023. And thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions. And this is my email or Twitter if you have any other questions. So thank you for listening.
Jordan, that was fantastic. Does anybody have some questions? Start over here.
So this isn't exactly on the subject of DAOs, but there's in general in medical research, it's sort of a truism. There's lots of ways to break things, and not necessarily. And the fact that you have two broken things next to each other, it doesn't imply that the cause is the same. So you can break people by putting them in space, and you can break people by letting them live too long. How do you know those mechanisms of breakage are the same? And that's sort of my question.
Right, absolutely. So I think one of the measurements on here was that heart rate decreases in space, right? You can fall asleep and your heart rate decrease. That doesn't mean you're sleeping with age. You can take drugs that decrease heart rate. That doesn't mean you're sleeping with age. But it's actual mechanisms of aging that are actually pathology, like osteoporosis, muscle atrophy, are non-transient. They do have the same mechanistic signature of the pathology on Earth. And we can see this through the multi-omic analysis of the astronauts. So I agree that there may be some slight differences in that, but largely the driving mechanism of this pathology is actually currently being fleshed out in the multi-omic analysis. It used to be kind of what you're saying, that these are true, but unrelated. But we're finding that on our microgravity experiments in-house and in spaceflight, we're seeing a large degree of overlap. And right now we're trying to tease out what is the actual space hazard that causes this. So I think a really interesting aspect of that is mental health. So astronauts go into confinement and they lose neurocognition. So they think slower, things happen slower. But is that actually is that radiation? Is that microgravity? Is that fluid dynamics? Is that buildup of pressure in the brain causing the brain to slow? Or is that just the lower social engagement that they have? So we're actually doing several experiments, kind of adding an exposure one at a time to see what one is it.
So the bottom line is you're checking out the cause.
Right. In a word, 2 words.
Variable isolation, challenging for sure. Another question up top.
I understand that you're introducing a DAO for funding reasons, and can you just discuss like what considerations brought you to that choice?
Right. So funding and governance. So as I'm sure people know, is that academia is very political. So bringing together 6 institutions to collaborate on something that's all important to them, but let's say each of them submit a grant to this consortium. Do we just say, oh, all the contributors get 1 grant? Because then you're really only competing against people in your lab, etc. So I think the DAO would also allow for people to guide the science in a meaningful direction. So it's kind of a way to also do customer discovery. You want the science to impact the people on Earth here. So like, just because one of the institutional or the proposers is interested in that doesn't mean that that is going to advance the field necessarily. So the DAO would also be a check mechanism to make sure that the consortium goes in the direction that is going to impact people on Earth too, and not just do science for science.
Bill?
This bears a remarkable similarity to my interest, which is basically putting together a DAO for rare diseases and having the patients themselves be the stakeholders inside this thing. So the point I want to bring up is, as you put this structure together and figure this stuff out, there's a lot of alliances out there that potentially you can build up besides just aging and space. There might be rare diseases, in fact, that you could go on and act as a beachhead for in terms of putting the structure together and maybe share resources. So
right. So just today they started an experiment for increased pressure in the brain for testing a medical device in space for hydrocephalus patients who have kind of poor shunts in their brain that cause increased pressure. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for that.
Maybe I can actually follow up on that one. I'm always so curious about this. Is the DAO effectively like acting like a venture capital organization from that perspective? And if so, what do the economics look like for, the people that purchase that token and are a part of the DAO? And then, the projects that you end up funding, do you end up owning a percentage of the IP in those? And is that transferred back to those token holders?
Right. So this is something that we've talked about pretty heavily. I'm just going to pull back like 1 slide or 2. So on this one, I kept it vague here because this is something that we're currently negotiating. NASA does not want people outside the US owning their IP. That is a hard stop. So we're thinking about negotiating the IP and adding the value to the tokens, through airdrop, pay, etc. I would love to do an NFT token, but the decentralized aspect keeps us from regulating where that goes. So that is something that we had to consider when designing this. So we think that we think the consortium will have higher bargaining power for royalty rights with pharma companies and device companies holding the IP and then distributing those royalties to the token holders.
That was a great answer. And I'll just follow up when I was chatting earlier about fixing identity, especially in these token markets. You need to sort of do things like KYC or make sure that somebody is in the United States or a US citizen, for example. And, we're following projects like Parallel Markets just released an NFT that they would issue to somebody that they have validated is a US citizen or an accredited investor or KYC'd appropriately, so that you could ensure that only those people are capable of purchasing your DAO token. And then, maybe you need to actually issue that token in a way that's soul bound to ensure that it can't be transferred to somebody else.
Yeah. I think that'd be hard to sell. I think it's a great solution, but it's hard to sell. So right now, this is kind of why why this is a dual presentation with the consortium and the DAO, because these institutions, there's nothing academics love more than a consortium. They get on each other's papers, they collaborate, they get more publications out of it. So basically say you want to join this consortium, all the IP goes to the consortium, and then they're like, they don't really care where the funding comes from as long as they get funding. So we kind of formed the DAO to fund it and kind of automate the whole review process as well.
Super interesting. Thanks for that. Great. Sorry, could you introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Name is Pavel Novichkov. I'm from FenaBiome. So my question is actually on the technical side, when you create this DAO, do you use some kind of platform or develop it from scratch?
I personally do not want to build it from scratch. I'm a scientist, or like a biology scientist. So I would really like to partner with like BioXYZ or Molecule. I've applied to them. So if you know anyone here, shoot them a text. I think my application's somewhere at the bottom of the pile. I'm sure they're very busy.
Vincent sponsored, so we'll make sure to make that connection afterwards.
Thank you.
On the side. And again, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Ron Van Maden, UNSW Sydney. So how are you managing the sort of review process for these project proposals, given that the token holders may not be scientific experts?
Right. That's a great question. So I know this diagram is very complicated, and I tried to simplify it as much as I could. But these DAO stewards would largely triage the proposals to make sure that they're in line with the mission of it. And we hope to make their reviews of the proposals public. So we could actually allocate experts to this, and they could say, we think this might work, but these are the challenges associated with it, which make it, high risk, high reward, or low risk, low reward. So then people kind of can frame their understanding of the project from a review, somewhat like a Yelp review or something like that. Because yes, very, like I said, very few people are experts in this area. Yeah. Yes.
Just a moment.
No, sorry. I shouldn't be.
I appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Miriam Zandy. I'm with TrueBlocks, which is an Ethereum data indexer and explorer. I don't know much about DAOs, but I know a little bit. And it's still very much early days. And some of the bigger challenges with DAOs tend to be around governance and engagement from token holders.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, sort of, is this going to be a permissionless type of situation? Is the DAO, are the DAO token holders going to be anybody who's interested, or are you limiting it to a certain type of individual?
So in a word, we want it to be everyone. And I agree that can lead to bad actors in the field, and that can lead to someone buying up all of them and dictating the entire consortium. There are ways to, which I'm sure many people here are aware of, so I don't want to, totally botch this, but there are ways to address the governance problem and say at least this many number of people need to vote on a certain project, increase the persons per vote, or you can also cap it at, a majority plus a certain amount to kind of increase the unity around a decision. So it's not just major token holders. And what was the other question? Oh, so we also want to have, I think that a big problem with maintaining the engagement is to do kind of what maintaining that community and having annual meetings, offering perks to holding the token, not just during voting, having extended podcast series and, explaining the science, explaining progress to those interested. Does that answer both your questions?
Still pretty early days for a lot of these DAO governance models, but the exciting thing is that people are experimenting with new governance models, whereas let's say equity systems or even most, democratic voting systems haven't changed in 100 years.
Right. Yeah. We've never really questioned, what if a bunch of people got together and voted for a certain government candidate, but now we're actually questioning it because you're designing your own kind of government structure. And what if, a project just creates a really clickbaity, kind of title for their research to get funded, and we've been dealing with this, but we've taken it for granted. We haven't really addressed it, outside of the DAO. So I think it brings to light a lot of questions in society in general.
Really fantastic questions. Does anybody else want to ask to Jordan? Please.
I guess maybe the final question is, given that you're doing this for NASA in part, and you've got these constraints of needing to be in the US, what's your sort of corporate structure for this? How do you fit into the legal system?
Right. So we're open to DAOify it through the state of Wyoming, and then have the consortium actually be a nonprofit. I would just, have a quick answer for that. I think that's really the most of the paths. This is a very, path less traveled, but of those, this is the most weed whacked, I guess. I don't know. Okay.
Really good question. We've changed currently
an
a C
existential
corporation,
question.
but that path to decentralization, I think, is the whole thing. It's like, how do you work your way there in a way that's smart?
Yeah.
Jordan, we have a few minutes left. Maybe you could tell us a little about your personal backgrounds. Sort of.
Yeah, of course.
How's your career gone before Web3? What got you excited? And
yeah, I guess I did kind of speed through that. So I am from Tennessee. I went to medical school there. After graduating from medical school, I was very interested in oncology, and having seen the difference between what patients were receiving in the clinic and what we were doing in our lab, I became really interested in translational medicine and how to bring discoveries and innovations from the bench side to patient care. So that led me to San Francisco area to do translational medicine at Baechle and UCSF, which is kind of a merge program between business and bioengineering and regulatory processes around clinical trials, et cetera, and dealing with the FDA. In this process, I became really interested in kind of root causes and kind of discoveries and innovation, and translating those innovations at the very root cause of disease and cancer in general. So that kind of led me to the Buck Institute for Aging, where I'm doing a postdoctoral fellowship in inflammaging, or inflammation-induced aging, and space medicine. And that has kind of led me to, I'm applying for NIH funding. I have, preliminary grant, but there's not really anywhere to kind of the next steps for this. There's only kind of small grants for this type of thing, no RO1s, nothing like that. So that kind of led me to kind of in multi-institutional collaborations using their discretionary funds to advance my research. But, that's not sustainable. So that's kind of led me here. And then, so this, instead of, sitting around and complaining about how there's no funding, I'm just going to go do something else. I'm trying to, create that space.
That's incredible. And then, and then how about with Web3? What have you been up to, that led you to this model? And
yeah, well, I've applied to, like I said, I've been applying to NIH funding for a while, and got really frustrated by the process, because you submit a grant, you get very, very little feedback. You just score back, basically says apply next year, apply to a different institution. And then I applied to actually VitaDAO. And I don't know if anyone here is from there, but if you are, thank you. Because like they just emailed me and just said, oh yeah, like we had a question about your application. We want to hop on a Zoom call and talk about it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Like I'm just used to getting rejected over the course of 4 months with like no feedback, and no one asked questions, like, oh, you want to like talk about this detail of it? Great. Awesome. I'm happy to change it, that kind of like led me towards a DAO, and kind of realizing how decentralized and kind of, non-legacy forms of financing and how to incentivize that structure, I found very intriguing. So I wanted to learn more. So here I am.
So cool. It's really a community that's making a lot of these things happen. That human interaction. And I just want to thank you for being a part of this today and sharing your experience with us, because that was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.